London's ultra-low emissions zone has become a bit of a political football. The expansion of ULEZ, which fines especially polluting cars to drive in the capital, was blamed for the Tories holding Uxbridge, but before that, it had long been a bugbear of the right. And anti-ULEZ activists are now taking matters into their own hands. This footage, shared by the Murdoch-owned Talk TV, shows a balaclavaed person climbing up a lamppost and removing a ULEZ camera. We're told it's filmed in Brockley, and that the activists, or vandals, depending on how you look at these things, is from a group called the Blade Runners. Talk TV also had a guest on to discuss the footage. This is leader of the Reform Party, Richard Tice, speaking to Mike Graham.
No one condones illegal activity,
no.
But regrettably, what we are seeing is the frustration of ordinary people who see this as a tax on the poor without any justification.
Tax. We were just talking
another
about that.
Tax on the poor without any justification, against the consultation, against the scientific data. And people are saying enough is enough. If the politicians, if they completely fail to properly represent us, then people's frustration boils over. So we don't condone it, but regrettably, it's happening here. It's happening with the protests against the migrant hotels. There's a number of different areas of life in the UK at the moment where the politicians are failing the people, whether it's what you're seeing with the shoplifting, all of this stuff. And people are saying, what is going on? Enough is enough. And as I say, people are just steaming furious with this. And this is the regrettable consequence.
Yeah, absolutely right.
It's a bit like with the Just Stop Oil protest. Eventually, drivers end up taking the matters into their own hands because the police have failed to deal with it.
Now, I've never seen a Talk TV host be quite so soft on someone who is, well, he says he's not defending the direct action, but clearly, it was a sympathetic account of what had gone on. Almost, I almost dared to believe when he sort of mentioned Just Stop Oil at the end, that maybe he would talk about, that nuance of the debate. It is a bit like Just Stop Oil. Obviously, they fought that they have a policy priority which is not being listened to by the political establishment, so therefore they take direct action. It's a little bit like that. No, of course, he was talking about the people who try and, push Just Stop Oil over or beat them up when they want to get past them in the road. So Richard Tice wasn't in the mood to talk about the fact that direct action can be complex. He wasn't saying, yes, I am sympathetic to this, but I wonder what this says about the left and how we talk about Just Stop Oil. No, neither him nor Mike Graham had any interest in such complexities. We do, though. And of course, it's not only pro-car activists who are taking direct action to achieve their aims. Just published on NovaraMedia.com is this article about a group called the Tyre Extinguishers, who have targeted a fleet of Land Rovers by drilling holes in their tyres. The action took place at a Jaguar Land Rover dealership in Exeter, where members of the group targeted at least 60 SUVs. Claire Heimer reports this. The group argued it was a necessary escalation and an act of retaliation for the death of 2 children after a Land Rover crashed into an outdoor tea party in Wimbledon, London in July. Children are 8 times more likely to die when struck by an SUV compared to those struck by a passenger car, according to a study published last year. SUVs are also more polluting than smaller vehicles. The Tyre Extinguishers said their action was intended as a, quote, non-violent demonstration to draw attention to the presence of grossly inappropriate private vehicles in our towns and cities, unquote. They hope it will serve as a wake-up call in order to prevent future tragedies and make our roads safer for everyone. Since March 2022, the Tyre Extinguishers claim to have deflated the tyres of around 20,000 SUVs across 18 countries, making them temporarily unusable. As our audience can probably guess, I'm pro-ULEZ and anti-SUVs. I would normally talk about the anti-SUV actions in a sympathetic light, the pro-ULEZ actions in a less sympathetic light. But I mean, they're very similar in terms of the form, right? They're very similar forms of direct action, taking sort of a practical measure, criminal damage essentially, not harming anyone. I mean, to be consistent, do I need to have the same opinion of direct action in both cases?
No, of course not. There's 2 separate bits to this. One of which is maybe a moral stand you might want to have about taking any kind of direct action, the sort of moral judgment you might form about what someone's doing, and that could be all sorts of different things for any given action. The other one is, I suppose, particularly when you're thinking about what the anti-SUV protesters are doing, is a sort of practical or political version of this, which is like, what impact does it have? Does this turn into something effective out the other side? We saw a version of that actually with Greenpeace protesting at Rishi Sunak's house last week. Does this turn into something that advances the conversation, that moves the politics somewhere, that changes how things might operate? And the difficulty, I think, with some of these direct actions where it's quite a small group of people going off and doing something subtly under cover of darkness and all the rest of it, is that you're not necessarily getting into the point where the thing that's really going to shift this, and this is what we've seen has always shifted things in the past, is when you have very large numbers of people prepared to protest and prepared to take part in something. And that's the force that starts to shift the argument here. So that would be my political kind of question mark to raise around the SUV protesters there, in addition to any sort of moral issues you might want to raise about some of these sorts of things. Of course, there's a very long history of direct action. I know everyone always makes this point, but we do have a history of direct action and protests and all the rest of it in this country over many, many hundreds of years now. Suffragettes is the one that people go to. Who's going to turn around now and say they were all bad? But if you look at what at least some parts of the suffragettes were doing, this was breaking windows in banks, smashing up post offices, on one occasion trying to set fire to a theatre in Dublin because the Prime Minister was visiting. I mean, really quite, this is getting really into some pretty violent forms of protests here. Who turn around later and say, oh, well, it's all wrong, it's all bad because of that. The real question to ask is, what are the politics? Does it get you to a political point you want to be in as a result of this? And that, I think, is the useful question to pose to the anti-SUV protesters.
When it comes to the broader politics of driving, the issue, sort of the big elephant in the room, can be summarised with a single number: 25 billion. That's the amount in pounds that the Exchequer currently collects in fuel duty, and which will disappear once Britain's car fleet is converted to electricity. And the government then will have to find a way to make that figure back again. The right-wing think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies, has tackled this problem and come up with a specific solution: road pricing. In their report, named The Future of Driving, the think tank suggested this. So these are their proposals: bringing in a per-mile charging system for electric vehicles to ensure that they pay their fair share. However, the aim should be that zero-emissions vehicles, or ZEVs, drivers still pay significantly less than their petrol and diesel counterparts, giving drivers a reason to make their next vehicle purchase a ZEV. They say these changes should be signposted well in advance. Charges for ZEVs should not come in until later this decade, so as not to dent take-up and give time to work out the practicalities. They also suggest each vehicle would be assigned a per-mile rate based on its weight to reflect wear on roads. Charges would be collected monthly by direct debit. And they say to reflect the public's concerns about fairness, drivers would receive a free mileage allowance based on their postcode. Drivers in remote areas with limited or non-existent public transport options would receive a higher allowance than big city drivers well served by trains and buses. Concessions could also be granted based on disability, low income, and so on, though such measures would involve a clear trade-off with economic efficiency. This is a right-wing think tank. So I think it's one of Margaret Thatcher's favourite think tanks, saying we should introduce road pricing. At the same time, I know that if a Labour politician suggested road pricing, the whole Tory cabinet would come down on them like a ton of bricks. Is road pricing inevitable? Is our politics ready for it?
Probably not, to be quite honest with you. I mean, look, a government could, if they wanted to, just say, do you know what, we'll just borrow the money instead. We'll just add £25 billion onto the deficit. There's a whole load of reasons why that's not necessarily a particularly desirable idea to just go, free car use for everyone. But you could potentially do that. And you might also think, well, perhaps we'll just cut £25 billion out of something else to try and cover that particular cost. There would be other options here. But I suspect we're going to end up with some discussion around this. But look how it's already going. Okay, so they're saying, right, we'll have a per mile charge in your car. Okay, so how are we going to actually enforce that? That's going to involve you monitoring that car being used. So either your electric vehicle has a chip or something in it that says, okay, this is how far you've driven, here comes your tax bill. So it's quite an intense form of surveillance. Or lo and behold, you're going to have to start putting up video cameras all over the place and sensors to try and log who's driving in and out and working out how far they've driven, all the rest of it. And we've just seen what another bit of the right thinks about that. So I think this is going to get really quite a tense political issue, with some of the splits and divides in it not necessarily falling very easily onto a natural sort of left-right split. There's something else in there, by the way, which is that, look, put it this way, it's what, £50,000, incredible really, is the average cost of a new electric vehicle car in the UK, right? It's streets ahead of what you'd pay for a new, or even a fairly cheap or not so cheap petrol engine car at this point in time. If you're starting to say, okay, we're going to kind of reward people who are driving electric vehicles, you're also saying this is going to be a set of people right now who are really quite well off. Now, if we want to do something about this, we might want to break out of just going, you personally have a car, you will get a car and that's your car and you drive it around. And if you're rich, you get a nice, decent car. And if you're poor, well, maybe no car at all. We might have to start thinking about carpooling, car sharing arrangements, or even, heaven forbid, getting more people onto public transport and really seriously investing in that.